Zach apologises for not being here. His wife is expecting her first baby in about a month's time, so not a sensible time to travel. But he was still keen that his work was presented here, so that we could, because I think there's some really interesting stuff that he's been up to. I might be a little bit biased on that because I'm involved in it, but hey. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about fitting marine recreational fisheries into the stock assessment process in Europe. So I talked earlier about the data. So here is about how we prioritise. So for those of you that don't know, marine recreational fishing in Europe is quite important. There's about 6 million participants, and they spend around 6 million, and they fish for somewhere around 77,000 days. 77 million days. But for many of the species, they catch a vast range of different species. In the UK alone, we have records for about 100 different species that are caught by our recreational fishers. And many of those species are either not assessed or data limited. And because of the issues with the data, there are a few stocks that are included in the assessments. And what we really need to do that is we can't go and say, okay, we need all the stocks to include recreational data. We need to work out how we're going to prioritise those stocks, because we want to focus on the ones which are most important, and a framework for how we do this. So how do we go about doing that? So the exam question, if you like, is how do we prioritise? And there's a method out there called productivity-susceptibility analysis, which has been used for many, many different things. For example, things like sharks, bycatch of sharks, and vulnerability of them. So what they're good for is they work well with data limited things because you can work on expert judgment. It's a risk-based framework, so we're not saying how important they are, we're just saying that they are relatively important compared to the other things. It combines our ability to include things like fishing and life history information, and we can kind of think about, it's a different methodology that we can think about because of the issues with data quality. But what we've done is we've looked at 40 species across 4 different ecoregions. So the first thing we had to do was really think about how we adapt the productivity susceptibility analysis to marine recreational fisheries, because a lot of the stuff that's been developed is very much for the commercial side of things. We took some frameworks from NOAA. There were some nice frameworks that have been developed for sharks as well, and we tried to adapt them to recreational fisheries because they have very, very specific wants, needs, desires, and how they fish. So we incorporated the regulatory, but also the social and the economic importance. So what you can see on the left-hand side of this is the criteria that we used in the categories. And we used expert judgment to kind of come up with the weights of those different categories. So the ones in grey are the ones that we didn't have any uncertainty around because they were things that were essentially known. And the ones in white were things that we kind of had to guess a little bit and we could incorporate uncertainty. So for each of those, we got an importance scale between 1 and 3. We had a weight between 1 and 3, which said how important that was relative to the other things, and also an uncertainty. And what we asked people to do was to categorize how uncertain they were about the criteria that they were giving. So we asked them to give a score and then say how certain they were about that. For the productivity estimates, we used FishBase where we could, but where there was no data on the species we were interested, we tried to either impute it from other similar species or deal with a precautionary score. So how do we go about getting uncertainty? So basically, as I said before, we asked each of the people, the experts that judge this, to say, okay, well, how uncertain are you in the scores that you've got? So from from highly uncertain, which was 3, all the way down to relatively certain, which was 1. And we ascribed a degree of confidence to that level of score. So this was based on work that's published elsewhere by Sophie McCulley-Phillips. And we took that if you're relatively certain, you were 90% certain, or you had 90% confidence, all the way down to if you're very uncertain, you had 20% confidence. And what we then did was we rescaled these scores between 0 and 1, and we were able to then say, okay, well, what would those distributions look like if we recreated them in terms of the certainty? And that's the picture at the bottom here that we can see. So you've got the relative importance. We simulated a beta distribution with the different levels of confidence with 2,000 samples. And what that gives you is the averages are at the levels of importance that you would expect, but also the error around it. You can see that the more certain you were, the less flat the profile is across the board. So what does that then move into? Well, we can then use this to create our vulnerability stores. So we weighted the importance of the vulnerability scores. So we had a weight and an importance, and we brought those together. You then calculate a Euclidean distance between the thing. For the different categories, we pick the worst case, and then we categorize these things based on the score that we got. So basically, if you were less than a 0.5 vulnerability score, you had very low risk. If you were greater than 1.5, you had a high risk. So what does that tell us in general about the types of stocks we should be working on? Sorry. Oh, get there eventually. Stop. Right. So these are the types of graphs you get out of it. So you've got productivity, susceptibility that you plot against each other, and then you've got the vulnerability scores, which are the kind of arcs that you've got on there. And you can see that the vulnerability arcs that you've got on there go up in about 0.5 inch things. And you can see that there you go from things which are generally low risk with lots of error around them, through up to things which are high risk relatively with limited error around them. And what we found was that the large sport fisheries were really the highest risk that we had. Common target species were generally moderately to high risk. The cephalopods were a real problem for us because of their uncertainty and their life cycles. And productive bycatch species were generally low risk. And this is quite important because it allows us to then prioritise what species we push forwards with into the stock assessment processes. But we did find ecoregion differences in our thing. So we had experts from a number of different countries that would rate each of these different ecoregions, and you found differences depending on the countries that people were based in. A good example here is black sea bream in the bottom left here, where you can see that in the Greater North Sea area, which covers halfway up to the English Channel, that in Belgium it was very low importance, and in the UK it was quite high importance. And the reason for this is the fact that you've got very specific habitat types that black sea bream need and to nest, and where they're targeted. We could also see differences related to across the Mediterranean. You can see at the bottom left-hand corner here quite a large variation between the countries for particular species that we were talking about in terms of their vulnerability. And there are also differences around how you target the species and the biology. So what did we find? Well, we had 44 high and 100 moderate vulnerability species or risk species. And we only have 4 stocks, around 3 species that were currently assessed out of those 100. Out of those 44. We know that cephalopods we need more work on. Elasmoranks are a risk because they're bycatch or they're caught in sport fishing, but they're very low priority. And we need more post-release mortality data because that's a problem for us. And what we need to do now is we need to think about data collection across a number of those different species and how we incorporate those in the ICES assessment process. So that's the prioritisation side of things. So stock assessors are a weird breed. I can say that because I'm one of them, I think. But in terms of the fishing community, the stock assessors tend to be quite traditional, and they have their approaches and their traditional approaches, and it's quite difficult to get new data into them and convince them that we should really include data or recreational fisheries in the assessments that we have. And one of the real problems that we found when we were talking to them is that it was really unclear how you would incorporate recreational fisheries into the stock assessment. So we sat down with a group of stock assessors and recreational fisheries scientists, and we created a whole load of flowcharts about how you would actually do this, so that people that were involved in the assessment could try and understand what they would do when they were confronted with recreational fishing data. And what we found was that the issues that they were seeing really was compatibility. That was between the assessment model versus the recreational data. So, for example, I said this in one of my other talks, but basically when we started to work with Northern Shelf Cod, I was asked to provide a time series from 1963 to today with errors on everything that had been caught and released, and post-release mortality, and how that changed with management measures. And that is a problem for us. So there's this lack of compatibility between the assessment model and the recreational data. We've got data limitations, as I've talked about. We need to then reconstruct some of the information, and there are issues around data quality as well, because the surveys are all done in different ways. So that's what that framework is designed to do. It's designed for stock assessors to look at it and say, okay, let's see how we can all incorporate data when we're kind of confronted by it. But regardless of whether we have a framework or not, the real importance is for the two communities to work together to try and understand what should be done, because every stock assessment is different. So, in summary, we've got a list of priority species now that we should be looking to include in the stock assessments in Europe. We've thought about how we can integrate MRF into the current assessment framework. We've generated a load of flowcharts to explain to the stock assessors how to use it. We need to impute the data for the stock assessment for things like post-release mortality, time series. So we need to come up with methodologies to do that. And last but not least, we need to think about how we allocate between the different catches, between the different sectors that we really are not at yet. And that was about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, really on time there. We've got 2 minutes for questions. Yes.
So in some cases, yes. In other cases, no. If you can imagine, you've got like 40 stocks across 4 regions, so that's 160 stocks. It's quite difficult to do that at that kind of, if you like, macro level. But certainly in terms of the historical reconstructions, we've used that information. I think I gave an example earlier of how technology had changed over time, and that affected our discussions with the angling community on that side of things, affected how we reconstructed back in time. I would really love to think about how we can integrate traditional knowledge more into stock assessment. ICES have been working on those types of ideas as well, because I think it's a really valuable source of information going forwards. I hate when we call it anecdotal evidence as well, because I don't think it's anecdotal. I think it's something that people have learnt over 30, 40 years of being in the environment. So I think I would like to see more of it, but I guess where I'm struggling is a little bit about how you incorporate it to that macro scale.
Hi, Kieran. Yep, nice talk. Thanks. My question is, so we know that maximum sustainable yield is working for commercial, but the evidence from these communities that maybe doesn't work for recreational fishing. So in your experience in UK, maybe Europe, do you think that in the next future we will be able to try to push this idea into operationalized in this kind of a stock assessments?
So what you're talking about is different management objectives.
Yeah, do not use maximum sustainable yield for recreational fisheries.
That's a very good question. We're having that debate quite heavily within the UK at the moment, within some of the fisheries management plans, because, as you quite rightly say, there's a tension in management objectives between, like, what is a maximum sustainable yield, which works well for a commercial fisher, to what I like to call maximum total satisfaction, which is probably more what we would be interested in for anglers. We have had discussions within the sea bass community about different strategies. One of the challenges is that MSY is incorporated within the European legislation. It's hardwired into the common fisheries policy. So that gives you a problem with how you change that. And there's a lot of inertia in the system. In the Fisheries Act in the UK, MSY is not quite so hardwired, because it says MSY is a minimum. So there is opportunity to think about it at that level. Where we get to it with it, I don't know what the answer is with that, but I know that within some of our fisheries management plans, there are views or there are objectives to try and consider alternate harvest strategies.